Hello everyone, my name is Crain. Today, I will be presenting my research on how different user interfaces affect the composition, interpretation, and usage of feedback on creative and open-ended works. To give some context for my research, many content creators rely extensively on online feedback exchange to iterate and improve on their creative works. The feedback exchange process can be conceptualized as a two-way communication between a creator and a feedback provider, each of whom has a unique role in the process. A feedback provider's role is to communicate their insights clearly and effectively to the creator, while a creator's role in turn is to interpret and extract meaning from the feedback they receive, and use that feedback to make revisions to their work. Effective feedback exchange requires balancing the needs of the feedback providers with the needs of the recipients. From the provider's perspective, feedback should be inexpensive to produce, consistent in quality, and easily accessible to potential recipients. From the recipient's perspective, feedback is most helpful when it is timely, justified, and task-directed. Although these ideals are not inherently mutually exclusive, limited resources often necessitate compromises at one or more steps of feedback generation. The trade-offs of producing feedback with one technique over another therefore necessitate careful consideration of which feedback attributes are most valuable to each party. Though rubric-based feedback is accessible and can be produced quickly, creators may perceive such feedback as less fair and invested in their work than personalized freeform comments, and providers may feel less capable of producing helpful feedback using rubrics compared to personalized comments. Similarly, while scaffolding techniques such as justifying rubric selections with personalized comments may reduce the cognitive load required to compose feedback, these techniques may also be time-consuming and more constraining for providers than communicating their thoughts through freeform comments. Despite the unique trade-offs associated with using any one interface for composing feedback, little research has compared these trade-offs from the perspectives of both creators and their feedback providers. To explore the trade-offs between different composition techniques, we conducted a 2x2 mixed factorial experiment of how the interfaces with which feedback is composed and presented influence creators' feedback perceptions and revision outcomes. This study was designed to answer three research questions. First, how does receiving feedback with different levels of detail affect the revisions performed on the work targeted by that feedback? Second, how does receiving feedback composed with different levels of detail affect the recipient's perceptions of the feedback? And third, how do feedback providers perceive the value of the feedback that they compose at different levels of detail compared to the time and effort needed to compose it? Our experiment consisted of writing, evaluation, and revision phases. In the writing phase, participants completed a short background survey and spent 15 minutes drafting a creative story of up to 250 words in response to a writing prompt. In the evaluation phase, participants were assigned to one of 4 experimental conditions, and providers composed feedback with a level of detail corresponding to the participants' assigned conditions. In the revision phase, participants reviewed the provider's feedback, revised their stories with respect to this feedback, and completed a post-study questionnaire. Following the revision phase, a second set of experts blind to the original stories performed randomized A-B comparisons to determine the extent to which participants made improvements between their initial and revised stories. A full list of measures for our study can be found in our paper and are omitted here for brevity. During the revision phase, participants were presented feedback at one of 4 levels of detail, depending on their condition. In the rubric-only condition, participants received assessments of their stories on 5 criteria: narrative cohesion, character exposition, use of imagery, writing mechanics, and sentence structure variety. In the open comments-only condition, participants received a single text box of comments on the quality of their stories and suggestions for improving them. In the rubric plus comments condition, participants received both a rubric assessment and open comments on their stories, as described in the 2 prior conditions. Finally, in the scaffolding condition, participants received the same rubric assessment and open comments as described in the prior condition, as well as additional comments elaborating upon the rubric selections for narration, characterization, and imagery. For the evaluation phase, we recruited 4 feedback providers from Upwork to critique participants' initial stories. Providers composed feedback for each story using a user interface corresponding to the story author's experimental condition. The layout of each composition interface mirrored the layout of the corresponding interface for presenting feedback to the participants. Following a within-subjects design, each provider evaluated approximately the same number of stories using each interface, and each story was evaluated by exactly 1 provider. To minimize order effects on providers' perceptions and evaluations, each provider was required to work through the interfaces in a different order and compose all reviews with a given interface before proceeding to the next interface. From the creator's perspective, one result from our study that I want to highlight today is that both revision quality and favorable perceptions of the feedback increased with the feedback's level of detail. Specifically, creators who received feedback produced by the scaffolding interface perceived their feedback to be the most helpful, perceived their providers to be the most credible, and performed revisions that received the highest quality ratings from the judges. A parallel result I'd like to highlight is that rubrics alone took the least time for providers to compose, were perceived as just as fair as the other types of feedback, and still help recipients make non-trivial improvements to their work. Providers spent an average of 6 minutes per story composing feedback using the rubric-only UI, compared to 4 minutes per story for the Open Comments UI, and 6 minutes per story for the Scaffolding UI. From the provider's perspective, one final result I want to highlight is that providers believed the scaffolding interface added unnecessary complexity to composing feedback, and suggested that Open Comments interface allowed them to write more helpful feedback for the recipients. As one provider stated, "I didn't really like the scaffolding UI because I believe having to write out explanations for each section just takes away from what should really be said in the overall comments. I think having just the one text box is the way to go. Easier to do and easier to get the ideas all together." This comment and others by the feedback providers suggest that the primary caveat of using rubrics stems from a forced selection among limited pre-authored statements, none of which necessarily reflects the provider's actual opinion. The provider's comments were also partially reflected in the creator's survey responses, which indicated that creators perceived providers who produce feedback using the rubric plus Open Comments interface to be the most invested in helping them improve their stories. Based on our findings from this study, our paper offers a framework for selecting the appropriate interfaces for composing and presenting feedback based on the needs of creators and their feedback providers. I'd like to share just a few of these recommendations today. The full list can be found in our paper. We recommend using rubrics alone to minimize the cost of feedback composition. Recipients perceive rubrics to be just as fair as the other feedback formats, and rubrics help recipients make improvements to their work comparable to those who received Open Comments. Additionally, because recipients made revisions of comparable depth and effort in each condition, the shorter time required to compose feedback with rubrics alone may allow for quicker, more frequent revision cycles. We recommend using rubrics with Open Comments to maximize a provider's satisfaction with the feedback they compose. Providers reported the rubric plus Open Comments UI was better than the others for communicating their insights and composing feedback they believed would be helpful to recipients. Providers also felt writing comments was easiest and most natural in the rubric plus Open Comments UI, and creators perceived providers of this type of feedback to be the most invested in their work. Finally, we recommend using a scaffolded rubric with comments on individual criteria to maximize revision quality. Compared to the other tested feedback types, feedback composed with the scaffolding UI led to the highest quality ratings for revisions, and was also perceived as the most helpful by the recipients. Our study makes 3 main contributions to the CSCW community. First, we contribute empirical knowledge of how the presentation of feedback influences a recipient's perceptions of the feedback and subsequent revision outcomes. Second, we offer insights linking these perceptions and outcomes with the feedback's composition cost and perceived value from the provider's perspective. Finally, we contribute an emergent framework for selecting feedback composition techniques based on specific attributes of interest and insights relating the cost of composition to the benefits of the resulting feedback. This framework includes recommendations such as using per-criterion comments to maximize revision quality, Open Comments to maximize the provider's ability to communicate their insights, and rubrics to minimize composition costs and turnaround. Thank you all for watching. I'd be happy to answer any additional questions you may have at this time.